What my daughter said to me at the gate, in front of 100 strangers. I still hear it some nights when the house gets too quiet. She said, "Dad, honestly, you're an embarrassment." And then she turned around and walked away with her husband, like I wasn't even worth watching leave. What neither of them knew was that the man standing there in his worn Carhartt jacket and scuffed work boots had, 6 months earlier, quietly sold the company he'd spent 31 years building for $47 million. And what they really didn't know was that the resort they'd chosen for their wedding, the one she'd called the most beautiful place in the world, I had purchased it as part of that deal. I didn't say a word. I just picked up my bag and found a bench near the window and watched the planes taxi on the tarmac. Let me back up. My name isn't important to this story. What matters is that I'm 63 years old, I've got 2 bad knees and a decent amount of gray in my beard, and I spent most of my adult life as the kind of man people don't look at twice. That was always fine by me. I grew up in a small town in central Ohio where my father ran a plumbing supply business out of a converted auto garage, and from him I learned that the quietest man in the room usually knows the most. I took that to heart. I started my own business when I was 32. Commercial HVAC systems, mostly for large-scale properties. Hotels, hospitals, university buildings. Not glamorous. Nobody writes magazine articles about men who keep the air circulating in a Marriott. But it was honest work, and I was good at it, and over the years the business grew in the quiet way that real things grow. No venture capital, no press releases, just contracts won on reputation and work done right. My daughter, I'll call her my daughter because that's who she is, whatever has passed between us, was born the year I signed my 3rd major contract. I remember holding her in the hospital, this tiny furious thing, and thinking that I would do anything in the world to make sure she had a life easier than mine. And I did. I paid for her college. I paid for her apartment in Charlotte when she moved there after graduation. When she called me at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday to tell me her car had died on the interstate, I drove 3 hours to get her. I thought we were close. That's the thing. I genuinely thought we were close. Then she met her husband. His name is, I'll call him my son-in-law, because I have to call him something, and he comes from a family in Savannah with old money, and very strong opinions about what old money looks like. His mother wore pearls to their first dinner together. His father shook my hand and spent the next 40 minutes talking to my son-in-law like I wasn't sitting right there. They were polite in the way that certain people are polite when they've already made up their minds. Within a year of that relationship, something started to shift in my daughter. Small things first. She stopped asking about the business. When I mentioned a job we'd landed, a contract for a new research hospital in Columbus, one of the biggest we'd ever taken on, she changed the subject. The next time she called, she mentioned, almost in passing, that her future father-in-law had recently restructured his portfolio and was looking at some very interesting opportunities in private equity. She said it like she was reading from a script someone else had handed her. I didn't say anything. I just listened. The engagement happened fast. 2 years into the relationship, my son-in-law proposed at a rooftop restaurant in Savannah with a ring his grandmother had apparently left specifically for him. My daughter called me right after, crying happy tears, and I sat on my porch and listened to every detail and told her I was so glad she was happy. I meant it. Whatever my reservations about the family, I meant it. But then the planning started. The venue they chose was a property called Hartwell Cove, a resort on the Georgia coast, about 90 minutes south of Savannah. Grand historic building, renovated over the last decade. Private beach, the whole thing. My daughter told me about it on a video call, practically glowing. Her future mother-in-law had discovered it and declared it perfect, and that was apparently that. What nobody at that table knew, what nobody except my attorney and my accountant knew, was that Hartwell Cove had been part of a portfolio acquisition I'd made 18 months earlier. Let me explain how that happened, because it matters. When I started getting serious about selling the business, I worked with a financial advisor I'd trusted for years, a quiet, serious man named, I'll just call him my advisor, and he recommended that instead of taking the sale entirely in cash, I consider rolling a portion of the proceeds into a commercial property investment group. One of the properties in that group was Hartwell Cove. I'd never set foot in it. I didn't choose it for any particular reason. It was simply part of the portfolio, and the portfolio made sense. I signed the paperwork in February. The wedding was announced in April. The venue was booked in May. I found out about the venue when my daughter texted me a link to the Hartwell Cove website with the message, "This is where we're doing it. Isn't it gorgeous?" I stared at that text for a long time. I thought about calling her right then. I thought about saying, "Hey, sweetheart, funny thing. I'm actually one of the partial owners of that property now." I thought about how that conversation might go. And then I thought about how it might also go wrong, how it might get twisted into something, how her future in-laws might suddenly change their warmth toward me, not because they'd reconsidered, but because the math had changed. I decided to wait, just watch, see what kind of people they were going to be. I got my answer faster than I expected. The first sign came at the engagement dinner. Her future in-laws hosted it at their house in Savannah, a beautiful old colonial on a street where every house looks like it belongs in a movie. I drove down from Ohio in my truck, which I noticed my son-in-law's father eyeing when I pulled into the driveway. I was wearing what I always wear to nice occasions, a button-down shirt, pressed slacks, my good shoes. I'd gotten a haircut. I thought I looked fine. Her future mother-in-law greeted me at the door with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and said, "Oh, you drove? All that way?" Like it was an eccentricity. Like people didn't drive places. At dinner there were 12 people around a table, and I was seated at the far end near an elderly aunt who spent most of the meal asking me about the best soil conditions for hydrangeas. I don't know much about hydrangeas. We talked about hydrangeas for 45 minutes. Meanwhile, at the other end of the table, my son-in-law's father was making toasts and telling stories and being the center of everything, and my daughter laughed at all his jokes. I drove back to Ohio the next morning. 5 hours in the truck with the radio off, just thinking. After that, it got more specific. My daughter called me 3 weeks before the wedding. She said there were a few things she needed to talk to me about. She said it in a careful voice, the voice someone uses when they've rehearsed what they're going to say. She told me that the wedding party photos were going to be very curated, and she needed me to understand that. She told me that the rehearsal dinner was more of a family thing on their side, and that she hoped I wouldn't mind sitting that one out. Then she told me, and I want to be precise about her words because I've thought about them many times since. She said, "Dad, I just need you to kind of stay in the background this weekend. You know? Don't make things complicated." I asked her what she meant by complicated. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "His parents have a certain sense of things. And honestly, Dad, the way you present yourself, it's just a little, I don't know, different." Different. I said, "Different how?" She said, "Dad, you showed up to dinner in a Carhartt jacket." That was at the engagement dinner in January. And yes, I'd worn a Carhartt jacket because it was January and it was cold and the driveway was long. I'd taken it off before I came inside. But that was apparently what she was holding on to. I didn't argue. I told her I understood and that I'd do my best. I didn't tell her about the resort. I still wasn't sure I was going to. Some part of me kept thinking she'd come back to herself. Some part of me kept waiting. I flew down to Georgia the Thursday before the wedding. I'd booked myself a room at a small inn about 20 minutes from Hartwell Cove. I'd decided not to stay at the resort itself, thinking it would be simpler. My daughter had arranged for me to be shuttled over with some of the other out-of-town guests on Friday morning. I was standing at the airport in Columbus, waiting to board, when my phone rang. It was my daughter. She said she needed to tell me something, and she hoped I'd be understanding. She said her mother-in-law had organized a very specific seating arrangement for all the pre-wedding activities, and for logistical reasons, she actually used the word logistical. There wasn't space for me in the shuttle. She said I should probably just get a rental car or take a rideshare. I said, "Okay." She said, "You're not upset?" I said, "I'm fine." Then she said, "And I think this is the moment I will carry with me longest." She said, "Dad, honestly, I think it's better if you just get there on your own. You kind of do better when you're not in the middle of things." Then she said she had to go, and the line went quiet. I stood at my gate with my carry-on bag and my boarding pass, and I thought about 31 years of early mornings and late invoices and weekends I spent at job sites instead of school plays. I thought about the college tuition checks and the midnight drives, and the time I quietly paid off $17,000 of credit card debt she'd accumulated after a bad breakup without ever once bringing it up. I thought about all of that, and I thought, okay, I'll get there on my own. What happened when I landed in Savannah is something I'm still working through. I picked up a rental car, a small sedan, nothing remarkable, and drove to the inn and changed my clothes. I wore the same thing I always wear: plain trousers, a collared shirt, a sweater because the Georgia evenings get cool near the water. I wasn't trying to make a statement, I was just getting dressed. I drove out to Hartwell Cove for the welcome gathering that evening. It was held on the lawn behind the main building, overlooking the water, with string lights strung between the live oaks and tables arranged with flowers I didn't know the names of. It was genuinely beautiful. I'll give them that. I found my daughter in the crowd and went to say hello. She was standing with her future in-laws and a group of people I didn't recognize, all dressed the way people dress when they want you to know they have a certain kind of money. She saw me coming and something flickered across her face that I haven't been able to fully name. Not embarrassment exactly. Something more complicated than that. I hugged her. She hugged me back briefly, the way you hug a coworker. Her future mother-in-law looked at my sweater and said, "Oh, that's a practical choice for the evening." Then she turned back to the conversation she'd been having. I found a spot near the edge of the gathering and I stood there with a glass of sparkling water, and I watched my daughter move through the crowd, easy and laughing, completely at home. And I was glad for her, I genuinely was, but I was also something else that I don't have a good word for. At one point, my son-in-law's father came to stand near me. He got himself a drink from a passing tray, and then he looked out at the view and said, without preamble, "Beautiful property." Then he looked at me and said, "She really has wonderful taste, my wife. She found this place on a travel blog of all things." I said, "It's a great property." He said, "What is it you do again? Heating and cooling or something?" I said, "HVAC systems, yes. Commercial scale." He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're waiting for you to finish. Then he spotted someone across the lawn and excused himself. The morning of the wedding was when it got bad. I arrived at Hartwell Cove early, as I'd been asked, so that the family photos could be done before the guests arrived. I found the wedding coordinator, a brisk woman with a clipboard, and she directed me to a spot on the lawn where the immediate family was gathering. I was standing there, in my good suit, navy blue, bought 3 years ago for my college roommate's daughter's graduation, still fits fine, when my son-in-law came over. He was already in his tux, and he looked exactly like someone who grew up knowing he'd wear a tux at his wedding. He looked me over once, quickly, and then he looked away. His best man said something in his ear. My son-in-law laughed. I don't know what was said. I didn't ask. The photographer started arranging people. My son-in-law's family arranged themselves with the ease of people who've been photographed often. I was positioned at the end of a row, between 2 of his cousins I'd never met, and when the photographer was adjusting something on his camera, I heard my son-in-law's mother say to her husband, in a voice not quite low enough, "Did no one think to tell him there's a dress code?" My navy suit was not wrong for the occasion. I've checked this with people since, and I was not wrong. But I heard it, and I saw my daughter, standing 6 feet away, also hear it, and she didn't say anything. She glanced at me with an expression I can only describe as pained, and then she looked away. That was when something settled in me. Not anger exactly, just clarity. A door closing very quietly inside. The ceremony was in the late afternoon. It was lovely. My daughter was beautiful in the way that daughters always are on that day. Whatever else is true, that's always true. I sat in the front row on the bride's side, and I watched her walk down the aisle, and I felt the full complicated weight of it. Pride and grief and love and something close to loss, all at once. During the reception, I sat at a table with her college friends and their partners, people who were kind and easy to talk to, and for a few hours I felt something loosen. One of her friends told me she'd always heard such great things about me. I didn't know what to say to that. My son-in-law's father gave a long toast. His mother cried gracefully. At no point was I asked to say anything. I didn't push it. But then, late in the evening, I was walking back inside from the terrace when I came around a corner and nearly ran into my daughter and her husband. They were just inside a doorway, talking quietly. They didn't see me right away. I heard her say, he doesn't fit, you know. I love him, but he just doesn't fit." Her husband said, "I know, he means well." She made a sound that was something between a sigh and a laugh. Then she said, "God, the suit." I stepped back before they saw me, stood in the hallway for a moment, then walked back out to the terrace and stood in the dark for a while. I had flown down here. I had rented a car. I had worn a suit I'd been careful about. I had stayed quiet all weekend, stayed out of the middle of things, stayed in the background like she'd asked. And I was standing alone on a terrace in the dark, while my daughter and her new husband, inside, talked about how I didn't fit. I thought about my father. He died when I was 45, a few years after I started the business, and the last thing he ever said to me was, "You did good, son. You did real good." He meant the business, and he meant the life. He was the kind of man who wore the same jacket for 12 years, because it was a good jacket and there was nothing wrong with it. I wondered what he would say if he could see me standing there. I think he would say, "Go home. You've been here long enough." I left the reception an hour after that, quietly. I found my daughter between songs, and I hugged her and told her she was beautiful and that I loved her. And she hugged me back, and for just a second she held on a little longer than I expected, like she was someone other than who she'd been all weekend. Then she let go. I drove back to the inn in the dark and packed my bag and left early the next morning. I was back in Ohio by noon. I didn't hear from her for 2 weeks. When she did call, it was a Sunday afternoon. She sounded bright and relaxed, the way people sound after a honeymoon, and she talked about the food in Tuscany and the hotel they'd stayed in, and how her husband had surprised her with a sunset boat ride. I listened to all of it and said the right things in the right places. She didn't say anything about the wedding. She didn't say anything about the terrace. She didn't say anything about the suit. When we got off the phone, I sat in my kitchen for a long time. What happened next came from a direction neither she nor her husband's family expected. It started with a phone call from the management group that runs Hartwell Cove. They were doing a routine communication to all investors about a planned expansion, adding a conference center and a new set of guest cottages on the north end of the property. They wanted to schedule a walkthrough for stakeholders who were interested in seeing the development plans in person. My advisor forwarded me the communication. I read it on a Tuesday morning, sitting at the same kitchen table, and then I did something I hadn't planned to do. I decided to reply. I drove down to Georgia in September, about 3 months after the wedding. I didn't tell my daughter I was going. I had a meeting with the property management team and the development architect, and we walked the whole north end of the property in the morning sun while someone explained load-bearing considerations and drainage engineering, and I found myself genuinely interested in a way I hadn't expected. When you've spent 3 decades thinking about how buildings work, you don't stop just because you've retired. After the meeting, I sat in the main building, the beautiful old part with the original moldings and the high windows, and I had coffee and looked out at the water. I thought about the string lights and the oak trees. I thought about my daughter's face when she walked down the aisle. The property manager, a practical woman who'd been there for years, sat across from me and said, "Can I ask what your plans are for this investment?" "Long term?" I said I hadn't fully decided. She said, "Well, you should know the property is in really good hands. We take care of it." I said, "I can see that." Then she said, "Were you at the wedding this summer? In June? We had a beautiful wedding here." I looked at her. I said, "Yes. I was there. It was my daughter's wedding." She was quiet for a beat. Then she said, carefully, "She's lovely." I said, "She is." We left it there. I drove home. I got back on a Friday evening, and that night I called my daughter. Not about the resort, just a call. She answered on the third ring, sounding mildly surprised. I don't usually call on Friday nights. We talked for almost an hour. It was the best conversation we'd had in years. She told me about her new apartment and a coworker she liked and a book she'd been reading. She asked about my neighbor's dog, a ridiculous golden retriever I'd mentioned once months ago, and she'd apparently remembered. At some point she got quiet, and then she said, out of nowhere, "Dad, can I ask you something?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Were you upset at the wedding? Like really upset?" I thought about it. Then I said I was a little lonely. She was quiet. I said, "But I was also proud." Both things were true. She said, "I didn't. I should have." She stopped. Then she said, "I think I got a little caught up in what everyone else wanted it to look like." I said, "I know." She said, "I'm sorry about some of the stuff I said. Before the wedding. About the shuttle and all of it." I said, "I know." Then she said something that surprised me. She said, "His mom told me afterward that you seemed out of place." She said it like she was being helpful, and I remember I just nodded, and then later I felt, I don't know, gross about it. I said, "His mother has her own sense of things." My daughter half laughed. She said, "That's one way to put it." We were quiet for a second. Then I said, "Can I tell you something I probably should have told you earlier?" She said yes. I told her about the resort, about the portfolio acquisition, about signing the paperwork in February, and getting her text about the venue in May, and sitting there trying to figure out what to do with that information. There was a silence on the line that went on long enough that I checked to make sure we hadn't been disconnected. Then she said very quietly, "You're joking." I said, "I'm not." She said, "Dad, you own Hartwell Cove?" I said, "A portion of it, yes." She made a sound I've never heard her make before. Part laugh, part something else entirely. Then she said, "Did you know?" "When I booked it." I said, "I found out when you sent me the link." She said, "And you didn't say anything." I said, "I wanted to see what things were going to be like." Another long silence. Then she said, "His mother went out of her way to find that place. She told everyone it was her discovery. She's been talking about it ever since." I said, "I know." She was quiet for another moment. And then she started laughing, really laughing, the kind that's a little helpless. And after a beat I laughed too, and we stayed on the phone like that for a while, the two of us, somewhere between crying and laughing in the way that only happens when something has been wound very tight for a very long time, and finally loosens. Her mother-in-law found out 3 months later. I'm not sure exactly how the information traveled, but by November my son-in-law's father had apparently made some inquiries. He has a financial advisor of his own, the thorough kind, and the name that kept appearing in the ownership documents for Hartwell Cove was mine. My daughter called me the morning after, still processing. She said her father-in-law had called her husband the night before, and her husband had called her, and the whole thing had unspooled in the span of about 4 hours. She said, "He told my husband that he wished he'd known, that if he'd known, things might have been, I don't know, different." I said, "Things were fine." She said, "Dad, he's been talking about that property like it's the greatest place on earth ever since the wedding. He was going to try to book it for their anniversary next spring." I said, "He's still welcome to." She laughed, but then she got quiet. She said, "Does this change things? For us, I mean?" I said, "What things?" She said, "The way they see you. Does it change how you feel about any of it?" I thought about that for a moment. About the shuttle I wasn't invited to share. About the suit. About the terrace in the dark. I said, "No, not for me." She said, "Why not?" I said, "Because the people who treated me the way they did it when they thought I was just a man in a Carhartt jacket. That's who they showed me they were. The money was already there. I was already the same person. None of that changed." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I'm sorry I let them. I should have said something. A lot of things, actually." I said, "I know." She said, "I was trying so hard to fit into their world. I think I forgot what my actual world looked like." I said, "That happens." She said, "I don't want it to keep happening." I said, "Then don't let it." It's been almost a year since the wedding now. Things between my daughter and me are different. Not perfect, but real in a way they hadn't been for a while. She called me on my birthday and talked for 2 hours. She told her husband about the conversation we'd had on the terrace, the one they didn't know I'd heard, and he called me a week later and apologized. It was brief and a little stilted, and I don't think he fully understood why it mattered, but he called. That was something. Her in-laws have been careful. Polite in a different way now, a more considered way, the way people are polite when they're paying attention for the first time. Her mother-in-law sent me a card at Christmas. Inside it said, "We'd love to have you in Savannah sometime. I haven't gone yet. Maybe I will. I still have the business, the old one, in the form of some advisory consulting I do a few hours a week. I still drive a truck. I still wear the same kind of clothes I've always worn, because they fit and they work and there's nothing wrong with them. I still think about my father sometimes, what he would say if he could see any of this. I think he'd say the same thing he always said. You did good, not because of the money or the property, because I knew what I was, and I stayed that way, even when someone was trying to make me ashamed of it. That matters more to me than anything that happened at Hartwell Cove. Though I'll admit, there's a particular quiet satisfaction in knowing that the most beautiful place my daughter ever found was one her father had already been taking care of for years, long before anyone thought to look.